Jonathan, thank you. What a pleasure to be here. And what a pleasure to hear those poems. And it was good. I was sitting next to Jonathan, who was translating from the British for me. And once I knew what a skip was, things became much, clearer. It's a great pleasure to be here, a great pleasure to be here with Brother Porritt, with Satish, my old friend, with many, many others. I've been, as the conventional speaker, the kind of representative of the past here with you, I've been assigned to speak for 30 minutes and not a minute more. With any luck, I'm starting my watch now, with any luck, in the spirit of less is more, I'll speak for 29 and end there. I'm aware that there is a mild insanity in crossing the Atlantic to talk about global warming. That is the story of my life and at the moment, and it illustrates the point that I want to be making in the course of this short talk about the tension right now between the need to act globally and to act locally, and the ways in which intellectually and to a certain degree in action I resolve them, just to give you some food for thought. It's a pleasure to be here in the lineage of real visionaries and to be able to hearken back to E.F. Schumacher. One of the great pleasures doing this was the opportunity to reread a bunch of Schumacher in the last couple of months and to think hard about why it is that we honor him so, and his contemporaries, the Americans, who at the same period were exploring the limits to growth and publishing on those questions. And the reason, I think, is because, many reasons, obviously, but they were deeply prescient about the approaching limits before they could precisely say what they were. They intuited them, in a sense, before it was possible to know exactly what we were going to run into. We no longer have that problem. Those limits are more and more and more visible. That is the story of 2008, which I think will go down as one of those years in human history, one of those years like 1848 or 1968, when the world looked very different at the end than it did at the beginning. I think we've come to understand a number of things in the last 12 months, and I'm going to talk about 3 of those limits as they've appeared here to provide the context for what else I want to say. 1, the big economic news of this year before the last few weeks was the sudden, undeniable to everyone, sense that we were approaching the limits of our use of fossil energy. That all of a sudden, the conflict between the finite supply of it and the infinite demand in a world of endless economic growth came into stark relief when the price of oil began to rise and rise and rise. What happened in short order was, and this may have had something to do with the subsequent economic crisis, what happened was that the flat earth that we've been talking about for the last decade or so, this frictionless place where we were able to move goods around without any problem, that flat earth suddenly turned into an uphill planet. And the grade steepening as energy becomes more expensive and more hard to get. That's a very important moment. Last year, my countrymen, for the first time since the car was invented, save World War II, drove fewer miles than they had the year before. That's an important break in a curve, and there are others. The number of airline passengers around the world has begun to fall instead of rise for the first time. In America, we estimate there'll be 25% fewer people in the air next spring than there were this spring. Even the ability to move goods easily around the planet is changing and changing fast. At the beginning of the decade, to bring a container load of stuff, of anything, from China back to the United States cost about $3,000. That number by midsummer was about $15,000, and it was changing the equation of what we wanted to do and how we wanted to do it. 2, the limits to greed are becoming apparent in the last few weeks. To absolute, unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism, do what you want to do, it's all going to work out. The greedier we are, the better it is for everyone else. The limits to that have become starkly apparent, and we now live seemingly amidst their ruins. And it is entirely unclear how, even if you wanted to, one would be able to rise this poor horse back to its feet and flog it again to make it give you one more little burst of the kind of economy that we have seen. It is a dead horse, and how we write its obituary in the next few weeks will be very important in figuring out how we go where we need to go next. Third, most importantly, the last year has revealed in ways that we haven't understood before the most significant limits to our occupation of this planet. I wrote one of the first books for a general audience about climate change 20 years ago, The End of Nature. So I've been following this question of climate change above all else for the last 2 decades. And it's been very interesting to watch it move from a hypothesis to a strong consensus, and it's been even more interesting and even scarier to watch it move in the last 18 months from a consensus to, at least among the scientists who know this stuff, to something approaching a panic. We have understood more in the last 18 months about the limits that we're transgressing than we understood before. We understand now the speed and urgency of this problem in a new way. So far, human beings have raised the temperature of the planet really only about 1 degree centigrade. We would have said 20 years ago that that would be bringing us just to the threshold of the global warming era, that we would look across from here and be able to see damage in the distance, but that we underestimated how finely balanced the physical systems of the planet were, and that's what's becoming evident. In the summer of 2007, when all of a sudden, 70 or 80 years ahead of the computer models, sea ice in the Arctic suddenly disappeared, when we suddenly had 25% less than we'd ever had before, a phenomenon repeated this year when, for the first time in the history of our species, both the northwest and northeast passages were simultaneously open and one could circumnavigate the Arctic on open water. When that happened, it sent shockwaves through the already, as I say, sober scientists who deal with these questions, and helped us focus on the other tipping points, or the other of these feedback loops that are coming starkly into relief. Some of you may have seen in the papers here in Britain last week, in the midst of all the financial turmoil, an even more important story, reports from a couple of research vessels in the Arctic about the sudden appearance of a phenomenon for which we had long worried, the rapid appearance of methane in large quantities from beneath the sea's surface. Research vessels describing columns of undissolved methane reaching the surface of the ocean and producing a methane foam across wide areas of the ocean. Since methane is another extremely potent greenhouse gas, and since it's one that we're not producing directly, we're producing it only indirectly by warming the planet, melting those methane clathrates beneath the ocean, and hence bringing it to the surface, it is entirely scary news. The one piece of good news, as it were, out of this period is that it has allowed us scientifically to arrive at a number for this phenomenon. A number I would submit to you is the single most important number, indeed perhaps the single most important fact that we now understand about our planet and how we're going to live on it. Before the Industrial Revolution, the background concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere was 275 parts per million. Call that the Eden number or whatever. For all the long tenure of all the city councilmen of Bristol, up until the Industrial Revolution, 275 parts per million was what was in the atmosphere. As we began to burn coal and gas and oil, that began to rise, but we never knew where the red line was, because this was a new experiment that we hadn't done before. Jonathan will remember that in the early days we used to talk about 550 parts per million, not because we had any really great idea that that represented a danger, but because it was double what there used to be, and hence it was easy to model on a computer. But it became psychologically the red line. Well, it's become clear over time that that was too high, but we didn't know where it was. When the Arctic melted, the